just going to go through some basics with music making in Ableton, just because I think that'd be quite useful to give people those tips. It's quite an intimidating thing to start making music in Ableton. I would say it's even more intimidating now. More and more people seem to be doing it, and it becomes more accessible. Whereas 20 years ago, you would have to be in a studio and master the art of the studio. Now people have setups in their bedrooms and their houses, which means that it's a lot more accessible than it certainly was, and a lot cheaper. I mean, I'm using my MacBook, which is cheap on the level of MacBook, and I'm able to produce some pretty substantial music, but it takes time to develop that, and starting that is the biggest step, I think. I teach a lot on how to use Ableton in live performance, but of course we can use Ableton to create music. So my first tip is don't be scared of using samples. One of the things that people get into is when they start making music is they get scared of using samples. I certainly know for me, when I was looking around forums and such, people would say, "Oh, you can't use samples because that's cheating." And I don't really understand why, because actually now I'm more of established as somebody who does this day in and day out. I understand that using samples that have been dragged in from a sample pack that I've bought may be slightly more cheating, but if you're going to sit there and you're going to cut them up, rearrange them, or add effects, for example, that's really not cheating. That's just using a source of sound as some inspiration for you then to develop. And many professionals use samples starting out, in some cases just for loops to start with, and then they'll recreate them. Or in certain situations, they actually stay in the final track. For example, Rihanna has a song called Umbrella, and the intro drum loop to that is a stock Logic drum loop that you can just drag in. And there's a dance producer called Steve Angelo, and his track Canas, the intro to that song is just a plain and simple dragged out of a sample library and dropped into place, and that's the main melodic idea. And samples are also great because it allows you to understand a sound or an element. So for example, if you're trying to find a certain sound that in a track, you can try and find a sample that's similar and then try and recreate that sample by recreating it using synthesis or using different elements of various different kicks. For example, if you're looking at EDM, people actually recreate their own kicks using different samples. And you can also take percussive elements out of tracks, if it's say a dance track, and use those in your own tracks, because it's hard to trace a kick drum. Whereas a melodic idea would be easy to hear. A percussive sound is really hard to pick out. But there is a couple of examples where producers have found samples that have been used, and one of those being Eric Prydz, who had a famous snare that was pretty much used in every dance track for the last 8 years, and he got pretty upset about that. My next tip is don't be scared to copy your favorite artists. It might sound weird, but copying those artists can be a great way of starting, because you're able to emulate their sound and work out what their process is. For me, my big inspiration when I first started was deadmau5, and all of my music kind of resembled deadmau5 because I would watch him make music on his live streams, and then I would go back and recreate that. That's the beauty of the live stream as well. So you can recreate the sounds and their mix and use the effects and and learn their synthesis to create those sounds, which is a really great starting point. And as you learn more about production, you'll develop your own way and your own sound, which you can then integrate into your productions, which means that your sound isn't going to no longer sound like a copycat of an artist that you've been following, but in fact you're going to take some elements and some tips and some ideas from their work, but you're going to develop your own sound into something that's more coherent as you as an artist. And it's really not cheating following your copying your favorite artist. It's more of a good learning process because you can understand what they're doing and develop that into your work. another tip that it took me a long time to get to this point, but I'm really glad that I do it now, is using a track for reference. So as I was saying about copying your favorite artist, in fact, you could drag one of those tracks into an Ableton session, into a track, audio track, and you could use that. And you can use that for not only listening to certain sounds, but you could also look at it as being different elements. So you could work out what sounds are being heard and then try and recreate those sounds. So for example, if you hear a piano, grab a piano sound and try and recreate that sound. Alternatively, it also helps with the musicality. So certain genres have certain things about them, such as tempo, keys, and certain types of chords, as well as various other things. But you can hear those and you can start to develop those ideas by listening and trying to, I talk a lot about a thing called reduced listening, trying to hone in on certain sounds by being able to understand what's going on. And by using reduced listening, you can use that to kind of isolate those sounds and take away all the other stuff to reveal certain elements. And using reference tracks can also help with mixing, because you can start mixing your track to sound like the reference track. Because if you've got hold of a track, it's probably going to be a high quality professional mastered track. So you can try and develop your mixing ability and try and match your track to that track, which is really useful for people who are beginning. And as you develop as a producer, you'll also start to look at using frequency analysis to pick out certain elements and copy the curves of the frequencies to be able to resemble that mix a little bit more closely. But to start with, you can just try and match it as close as possible. So if it sounds a bit too bright, your track compared to the reference track, you can pull the high frequencies down on the master bus, or add a little bit more bass into the bottom end by using the same sort of things, and also try and reach the same sort of levels, if that makes sense. So one of the other things is using presets, whether that be synths or effects. And this can be seen as cheating again, but again, in my eyes, I don't think it is. I think it takes skill and development to be able to achieve these things, and they're just a great starting point. And I still use quite a lot of presets in my work, certainly with synths, because somebody's actually sat down and painstakingly recreated those sounds. Why do we need to start at day one when we can start a few days in, if that makes sense? But
Yeah.
I don't just use a stock preset. I will change it and I will develop it into my own sound to fit my own work. So for example, if I was working with a vocal when I first started, I would just go straight over to a compressor and I would drag a compressor and then look at it and think, what's going on? So I would grab a preset, look at a compressor, and start to understand what different things within the compressor would do. So for example, start playing around with different parameters such as ratios, makeup gains, attack, release, and knees. Knees is quite funny, but it's just a technical term that I'm not going to go into. But yes, it's called knees or soft knees, which is very funny, and I laughed quite a lot when I first learned about it. And you can also use presets in order to learn synthesis, and drag presets in to learn how a sound's created. So you can start from the very basics of learning how saw waves and sine waves and triangle waves all come together to combine to a sound. But for those more advanced sounds, certainly in electronic music, those hyper growls that you hear Skrillex developing and other people making, you can actually start to unwrap those sounds by seeing the component elements being created in the synthesizer, and then you can start to hone your knowledge of synthesis and start developing your own sounds once you have a good idea of those sounds. Kind of my final tip for this is using templates, and this is great because it's kind of like the ultimate tip. Templates are really easy to get a hold of now. They normally cost anywhere from $20 to $30, maybe a little bit more. Certainly for me, it cost me about £25 to £35 to get hold of a good, decent template. And they use templates are just a general kind of track that have been made in a style of that you load into Ableton. So I've got an example here. Just to show you. Um, and this is great because you can see all the different component elements. So this is as it was out of the when I bought it and downloaded it. So you can see here there's all these different elements: there's drums, snares, claps, arps, synths, and so on, and sound effects that are added in, and there's lots of different elements. But these elements are all pre-mixed. So these are all have effects being added to them, and even synths being used default in Ableton. And these are great, as I was saying earlier, just to be able to understand how a certain sound's being created. And Don, we talked about automation yesterday. All the automation for the different track elements are also here. So this is the cutoff of the ARP, which changes along the timeline of the track, and same here with the auto pan. And these are really great just to get in depth and understand how a professional sounding track is created. So I bought this a few months ago because I wanted to start making techno. So I bought this so I could start to understand how to create that sound. And also the beauty of templates is you can save the presets to start with. So if there's a good mastering chain that you want to use, you can just then save these presets and use them in your own work, and then tweak them as and when you need to change it for your project. But that's a really great kind of starting point for you to start creating music with. And it allows you to also look at the structure of a song, because one of the things is trying to build the structure. It's hard to understand which elements are being played and which elements aren't being played. Certainly in more in different dance tracks, it's hard to work out when there's a hi-hat being played or there's been a sound effect, but this actually breaks it down into the elements and the different component parts, which is really useful as well. So that's kind of all the points I wanted to make. Is anybody?